Hi, and welcome to today's episode of Piano TV. I am Allysia, your host, and today we are going to talk about the weird and wonderful life of Glenn Gould, the very eccentric Canadian performer. He's most known for his recordings of Bach and Baroque music, although he did record a diverse array of music. This video is divided into three parts. We're going to talk about Glenn Gould's life, and we're going to talk about his quirks and eccentricities, and then we're also going to talk about his playing style, his recordings, practice, philosophies, and stuff like that. So let's get started. So let's start with the basics. Glenn Gould was one of the most renowned classical performers of the 20th century. He was born in 1932, died in 1982, so he lived to be 50 years old, and he was Canadian, born and raised in Toronto, died in Toronto. He's best known for his performances of Bach, but they're really polarizing performances. It's kind of like one of those you love him or you hate him situations. And the reason they were so polarizing is because Gould believed in taking creative liberties in recordings. So people who have really specific ideas of what Bach should sound like might really hate Gould because Gould, does things the way he thought things should be done. Okay, so Glenn Gould's life starting with his childhood. Unsurprisingly, he was one of those child prodigies, and he came from a musical family. And his mom in particular really wanted him to be a musician, and she apparently exposed him to plenty of music when she was pregnant with him and then when he was a small child. When Glenn Gould was 3 years old, they discovered that he had perfect pitch, and he actually learned how to read sheet music before he ever learned how to read regular words. Where other kids would just how kids like to mash piano keys, apparently Glenn Gould was really fascinated with the sound of the piano, and he would play a note or chord and just listen to the sound fade away. He joined the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto at age 10 and passed his final exam at the age of 12, achieving the highest marks of any candidate before that point. That meant at age 12, Gould was fully qualified as a professional pianist. And then much farther in the future, the Royal Conservatory of Music renamed itself to the Glenn Gould School of Music in the 90s. Canada, especially Toronto, had a lot of pride for Glenn Gould. Gould did some performing and live performances and touring when he was a young man, but he officially quit public performances when he was 31 years old. And there were a few reasons for this, one of them being anxiety with public performances, but he also was much more interested in recording music as opposed to performing it, and he wanted to devote his time and energy into that instead. He actually had kind of a dark perspective on performing. Like, he considered the audience to be a force of evil, and he had this perspective that everyone in the audience was like rooting against the performer, so that people would just, go out to see a live performance to see someone fail. And yeah, if that was your perspective, it makes sense that you wouldn't like performing very much. Glenn Gould performed less than 200 times in his lifetime. And that might seem like a lot, but a standard performer would probably, if that was your job, you might be looking at 100 performances a year. So compared to other piano performers, that was pretty much nothing. Instead, he developed a love affair with the microphone. He liked having control, and he liked being able to splice together recordings. And while some people might consider splicing together a recording to be inauthentic, he likened it to being a film director. He basically said that no one expects that when they go to see a 2-hour movie, that the movie was made in 2 hours. They expect it to be a long process with lots of cuts. And he said a musical recording should really be considered no differently. On cutting together his recordings, Gould said, "The tape does lie and nearly always gets away with it." Interestingly, studio producers who worked with Gould said that he needed less splicing than most performers. He didn't piece his recordings together to hide sloppiness or anything like that. Instead, he did it to have complete creative control. In addition to the piano, Gould also had other hobbies, especially writing. He did a lot of writing for journals, contributing reviews and commentaries on music and life. He also said himself that if he wasn't a piano player, he probably would have been a writer. And he did other things too. He did public broadcasting through CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Station, where he would do performances and commentaries and stories. Glenn Gould was a self-confessed hypochondriac, but that doesn't mean that every single one of his ailments was imagined. He was terrified of having high blood pressure, for example, and that's probably what killed him because he had a stroke at the age of 50. But he was also a germaphobe, and he wore gloves pretty much all of the time. even going to the extent that he wouldn't even shake people's hands. Glenn Gould also had a spine injury when he was a child, which we'll talk about when we talk more about his chair. But ever since then, he was basically on a cocktail of prescription medications, which probably contributed to his ill health. When Gould had a stroke, it paralyzed the left side of his body and left him with brain damage. Gould's father then decided to take him off life support, and his funeral was attended by over 3,000 people. It was broadcast live on CBC, which is Canada's main broadcasting network. The first few bars of Bach's Goldberg Variations are carved into his headstone, which is the composition that he was most renowned for recording. Let's talk about some of Gould's eccentricities, and we'll start by talking about his chair. When Glenn Gould was a boy, he injured his back in a fall, so what his father did was make him an adjustable chair for the piano. Gould ended up using this chair for the rest of his life, even taking it with him on overseas travels. This chair was a really low height, and that was part of what contributed to Glenn Gould's unique technique on the piano. Apparently, he was able to pull down on the keys instead of striking them from above, which was something that was encouraged by one of his conservatory teachers. Another strange habit of Gould's was to actually sing while he was playing piano, even on recordings, much to the chagrin of the people who recorded him. This is a habit that he started as a child because apparently his mom told him to sing everything that he played, and he basically couldn't break the habit ever since then. Listeners and music critics aren't always fans of these vocalizations. In the 1981 recording of the Goldberg Variations, a reviewer said that listeners would find the groans and croons intolerable. Other unusual things about Gould include the way he would move his body when he played piano in like circular motions. The height of the piano needed to be really, really specific, and he had his chair, which was really, really low, and he would tour with his chair, he'd travel with it everywhere. Basically, his chair was like an appendage. He also really hated being cold and insisted on having the temperature of the recording studio to be really, really hot when he was recording. And kind of a funny story is one time when he was in Florida to perform, he was wearing like, full out Canadian like jacket and mitts and a toque, and the police arrested him because they thought he was a vagrant. Gould also struggled in social situations, and when he was an adult, he basically tried to minimize his social contact as much as possible in person and do most of his correspondence via mail and telephone. Gould was so averse to touch that there was one story about a Steinway technician who like slapped him on the back as a greeting, and Gould was like so rattled by that he thought that he might have, he complained about maybe having permanent injuries from it. He was so shook that he thought it would negatively affect his piano performance. He wasn't a huge fan of social events, and aside from performing comparatively small amounts over his lifetime, he was also notorious for canceling performances at the last minute. Gould was a creature of habit. For example, he would visit Fran's restaurant in Toronto, right around the corner from his apartment, every night between 2 and 3 in the morning. He'd sit in the same booth and order the same meal every time. One common topic of debate when it comes to Gould's eccentricities is whether or not he was on the autism spectrum. The theory is supported by a friend of Gould's and psychiatrist who wrote a book about him. The friend is Peter Oswald, and the book is called Glenn Gould, The Ecstasy and Tragedy of Genius. Now that we've talked a bit about Gould and his life and his strange quirks, let's spend a little bit of time talking about his piano style and what makes him so unique as a performer. Probably one of the most remarkable features of his playing is his clarity. He has a really, really clean and almost like sparse way of playing the piano, which is why his Bach and Baroque music really, really shines. Since Baroque music is polyphonic, meaning multiple melodies all at once, clarity is key. Gould's finger technique was also legendary. He could play really, really quickly while maintaining the individual integrity of every single note that he pressed. When he was at the conservatory, he was trained in a style of playing called finger tapping, which you can think of like almost as using your fingers and not your arm in an almost like mechanical fashion, like a lever getting pushed. Aside from his sparkling and immaculate technique, he was also known for putting his own creative twist on things. In Gould's opinion, there was no point in making a recording if you weren't going to make it different than all the other recordings out there. Most of us do know Gould for his Bach recordings, and that's what he's most famous for, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But he also recorded in a bunch of other styles as well. He recorded Renaissance music. He recorded other Baroque music. He recorded Beethoven. He really was not a fan of romantic music as a whole, though, including Liszt and Chopin, which he deemed too sentimental. Basically, Gould hated what he deemed musical hedonism. Basically, music that was really like self-indulgent and overly emotional. He didn't really think it had a place. He wanted his music to be more serious and spiritual. This is the reason that he criticized lots of Mozart's later works, because he thought that Mozart started going in a downward spiral of musical hedonism, and Gould is even known to have said that maybe Mozart died too late as opposed to too young, because he thought the quality of Mozart's work spiraled downhill. Controversial opinion. When asked about not wanting to play Chopin, Gould said, "No, I don't. I play it in a weak moment, maybe once a year or twice a year for myself, but it doesn't convince me." Gould considered Baroque and its contrapuntal nature to be more serious, spiritual, and artistic than the simpler homophonic music that came later. Gould's recording of Bach's Goldberg Variations was his breakthrough work, and it became one of the best-selling classical albums of all time. Gould loved Bach. He is quoted as saying that Bach was first and last an architect, a constructor of sound, and what makes him so inestimably valuable to us is that he was beyond a doubt the greatest architect of sound who ever lived. He made recordings of virtually all of Bach's important keyboard works, including the organ composition The Art of Fugue, which is wildly difficult, and Gould was a piano player, not an organ player, so that makes it even more impressive. Unfortunately, he didn't finish The Art of Fugue before he died. One thing that I always find interesting to explore when I'm learning about different performers and composers is what their personal philosophies about piano practice are. And Gould is a little bit weird because he was fond of saying that he didn't really believe in piano practice, and he kind of brags about how he didn't really practice piano very much. Instead, what he did, instead of physically practicing for, most of the time, he would practice in his head by reading music. This was something that he learned how to do at the conservatory. And we kind of have to take this with a bit of a grain of salt, because obviously Glenn Gould, like every other piano player, did have to practice piano. But he just didn't think that, it kind of blew his mind that other piano players would spend hours and hours and hours rehearsing the same thing over and over again. That wasn't his style. So overall, Gould was opposed to slaving at the piano and spending many hours at the piano, which is sort of similar to Chopin's philosophy as well. Gould was undoubtedly extremely skilled at the piano, and apparently he once challenged his friend to name any piece of music that he couldn't instantly memorize. He was so good at memorizing music that he could apparently do it on the spot. And this is probably because he spent so much time reading music and learning music by visually learning it instead of playing the keys. He probably had something of a photographic memory. And that concludes our discussion on Glenn Gould. I hope you enjoyed this tour of his life. I think he's a really fascinating person, or was, I should say. Definitely go check out his recording of the Goldberg Variations as a starting point, and then, feel free to branch out from there. It is awesome. Thank you so much for watching this video. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Hang out on social, which you will find links to at the end of this video. And if you want to visit the blog, you can find that in the description bar below. Catch you next time. And what makes him so inestimable... Gould's